Wonderful. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us this lovely Thursday evening for this month's edition of the B-List Book Club. We have people here with us in person, which is delightful, and online as well. And we begin, as always, by acknowledging that we are gathering on what always was and always will be Aboriginal land. Here, where the library is in Sydney, that means Gadigal land in the Eora Nation. And I encourage everyone watching at home to spend a moment and think about the land where you are, and to celebrate and also acknowledge with deep respect that Australia is home to the oldest living culture, that colonization is not a thing in the past, that it is ongoing because sovereignty was never ceded and there has been no treaty. And I support the Uluru Statement from the Heart. And that's what I mean when I acknowledge that this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. We are joined tonight by my friend and the very accomplished and incredible author, Emily Maguire. We're going to be talking about her latest novel, Love Objects. I was honoured and delighted to be able to read an early copy of the book, and I spent a long time crafting this endorsement, so I'm going to read it out because it can do a better job of anything I can do off the cuff. This story is full of grit, with rough edges and harsh truths, but the humanity that shines through is phenomenal. Love Objects has got to be one of the most big-hearted novels I've ever read. Each person fully formed, each scene and new catastrophe rooted in truth. I learned something deeper about struggling and coping against class, and I looked anew at how I relate to the things I own. I finished this book in 2 sittings, and I challenge anyone to pick it up, then simply put it down. I truly believe the talent and insight on display here place Maguire in the company of greats. Emily Maguire is the author of 6 novels, including the Stella Prize and Miles Franklin Award shortlisted An Isolated Incident, and 3 nonfiction books. Her articles and essays on sex, feminism, culture, and literature have been published widely, including in the Sydney Morning Herald, The Australian, The Observer, and The Age. Emily works as a teacher and as a mentor to young and emerging writers, and was the 2018-2019 Writer in Residence at the Charles Perkins Centre at the University of Sydney. Please make her feel very welcome. And a reminder to everyone here, as well as people watching from home, we do take audience questions for at least a full 10 minutes, if I can stop myself in time at the end. For anyone watching at home, you can type your questions into the Q&A function on the Zoomy Zoom at any point in time, and I will go to those as well as questions in person. Emily, I got to see your Sydney sort of launch a few weeks ago, and in your speech, you mentioned that you had been sort of sitting on the kernel or the sort of seed of the idea for this book for 5 or 6 or something, a long time, 5 or 6 years, before you then put in an application for the fellowship. Tell me about what that seed was and why you sat on it for that long.
Yeah, so the seed, there wasn't one specific little moment I can isolate, but as with many things, with a novel, especially for me, but with any kind of writing or creative project, it's sort of something that started to occur to me more and more often, and I was thinking about more and more often. And that was around the idea of people who are labelled hoarders in our culture. I've known a couple of such people and have always been interested in why they do this thing that I don't do, which is to pretty much keep every single item that passes through their fingers, and feel great distress at getting rid of that. So I think that's going back even like well over a decade, maybe 15 years that I've been thinking of that. And then it was probably 5 or 6 years ago that a character started to actually form who became Nick in the book. But this woman who was happy and lived a happy, fairly ordinary life. And there was just this one thing about her that other people would judge and shame her for, but that in herself, without that outside eye on her, actually made her happy. And that was this thing that people would call hoarding. So the idea kept coming back with more detail added, the way that characters tend to sometimes just grow and grow. But I didn't want to write it without understanding more about this behavior. because I know it's so stigmatized. Most of the sort of popular culture representations of hoarding behavior fall very firmly into the freak show, repulsive, shaming type of category, even the ones that purport to be helping, like the reality TV show Hoarders, where they bring in experts and they make a bit of a show of trying to help. And I didn't want to contribute to that, but I also didn't want to be ignorant about it in the other way, over romanticize anything, because I know it's a behavior that can cause real harm. And so, you know, I did sit on the idea, or it just sort of sat with me for a while. And then, yes, the opportunity came up to apply for this fellowship that would allow me to dig into all of this stuff and to start trying to get answers to some of the questions that I had. And the great thing about that was that I didn't have to write this book out of that fellowship. The Judy Harris Writer in Residence Fellowship at the University of Sydney Charles Perkins Centre, you apply for it with the idea of a particular project, and that's what I did with what became this book, but you don't have to hand something in at the end of it, because there's scientists there. It's the opportunity for a creative writer to work alongside scientists for a year, and they understand that sometimes your thesis, your idea, your thing you put forward, you test it out and it doesn't work. And so they had this really open approach to going in and playing with these ideas and seeing if what I wanted to write about actually was a thing that I could and still wanted to write about. Fortunately, it was in this case, but having that pressure taken off of thinking I have to churn something out no matter what, really allowed me to take the kind of deep dive that I wanted to make sure that I could inhabit this character properly and do her justice.
What does that actually mean, that year of being like working in the same building alongside the scientists? Can you tell us more about what that year looked like? Because the very final thing you mention in the acknowledgements of the book, which is often the sort of, I don't know, that's the space as an author where you really make a point of who you truly feel grateful for. One of the things you mentioned was all of the people who either had lived experience or knew someone with lived experience who spoke to you. Was that a part of what you were able to do during that year?
Yeah, and that was amazing, because that was never part of my plan going in, because the plan going in was to actually think about the science behind hoarding behavior and to try and get my head around that. The idea, for those who don't know, around the Charles Perkins Centre, it's a medical research sort of hub. And the idea is to put together people who might normally be kept separate in a usual university setting. So all the different sciences in there, as well as philosopher, and then throw a creative writer in there, so that all these ideas are sort of cross-pollinating. The questions I was asking initially, because no one was actually studying hoarding behavior there specifically, but the questions I was asking were to do with those sort of deep level of human behavior, and especially in terms of the public health question, which they think a lot about there at Charles Perkins, but in terms of things like the obesity epidemic or smoking, those kind of things, why, when people know something isn't good for them, do they keep doing it? Which is the ultimate frustration of doctors and clinicians and medical researchers, that people know better and yet they don't do the thing. And so a lot of my initial questions were around that. As I understood more and more how hoarding behavior did and didn't fit into those same kind of paradigms, I actually was able to reach out more. Having this sort of label as the writer in residence gave me a certain entryway into other communities, including attached to Westmead and Royal Prince Alfred Hospital, which allowed me to then connect with social workers and psychologists who work on the front lines. When someone like Nick in the book has an ambulance called to their home, and the ambulance, the paramedics will then often report back that this person, it's not safe for them to go back into this home. And so it's hospital social workers that often have to try and deal with that. So I managed to really spend some wonderful time with some of those incredible people. And then through those connections, gradually get to know a few people who were in treatment for hoarding behavior. Now, that's a really rare thing, because most people don't self-identify at all. And most people with hoarding disorder don't want help. They actually feel pretty good about their behavior. So that alone was a hard thing, to find people who were actually acknowledging that it might be a problem in their life and wanting to talk about it, or willing to talk about it. At the same time as all of this sort of more official program that I was going through with this research, I took the opportunity for the whole university and the associated hospital communities to sort of do talks about what I was doing, explain what I was doing there. And the number of people who got in touch with me and said, I have a story, I want to talk to you, that weren't part of that official research thing. It was just them knowing what I was working on. And it was incredible. It was so generous, and my thinking was changing constantly as I was feeding back and forth with people with the lived experience of this behavior, as well as researchers talking about the science behind it, and all of that was really feeding into this idea I had of this character, and thinking, well, how does what I've just learned today change what I think was going to happen next in this novel, and not letting the research drive the novel, because it's still a work of fiction and a work of imagination, but letting it actually expand the possibilities of that world. You know, the more I sort of understood the complexities of this kind of behavior, and also how incredibly diverse people with this kind of behavior are, that was a real opening up and a real freeing effect, because it's not like trying to write a type. You're still, like with all fiction, just trying to write a specific person who happens to have this behavior that other people think isn't great, but that's actually, in her own conception at least, that's the least of who she is, and it doesn't in any way define her.
Okay, perfect opportunity. I want you to tell us about Nick. You've mentioned two things. One was that that this character started, building in your mind in the years leading up to when you started actually writing the book. And also you mentioned that people often don't self-identify as hoarders. And then you just mentioned then that Nick would think that this was sort of the smallest part of her sort of life, that it doesn't define her. Can you sort of introduce us, for anyone who hasn't read the book yet, introduce us to Nick and the things apart from the hoarding that make her her?
Yeah, I mean, in her case, she wouldn't use that term at all, or think that it's not even the smallest part of who she is. It's not part of it at all. Nick is in her early 40s. She's a proud, lifelong checkout chick. She really loves her job and is happy in it. She lives in a little house in Leichhardt that she was fortunate enough to inherit from her mother. So in this extremely gentrifying suburb, she's holding fast to her little cottage. She likes to feed the neighborhood stray cats, which really pisses off the neighbors.
I loved that detail.
Don't like the footprints over the top of their cars, and the animals hanging around. So she's a bit of a pest in that way, but to her, she just thinks, what kind of grumpy bastards would begrudge some well-fed cats. So she really sort of walks her own path, and she's happy. Her closest relationship is with her niece Lena, who they've always been close. And then because of other stuff going on in the family, Lena, at around the age of 12, moved interstate. And so Nick was sort of on her own for a long time without that special relationship. But Lena's come back to Sydney now when the book starts for uni. So they've sort of rekindled that, and that too makes Nick really, really happy. So the only thing that other people would think is something wrong, and she really doesn't, is that her house is really, really crowded with stuff, but the stuff makes her happy. She feels safe in her home. She feels, it's a treasure trove. It's a joy to her.
Can you give an example? Because that's what I found one of the, when I said this book was so big-hearted, something that I'd never read about, like hoarding behaviors before, and I'm, I suppose, one of the few people who doesn't, to my knowledge, know anyone who has that behavior. Like, can you give a couple of examples of how much love she attaches to these objects, like the blue tack beside the bed, I remember?
So the thing with Nick is that she actually, the way she thinks and feels about her stuff is the same that pretty much everyone here thinks and feels about some of our stuff. It's just that that's applied to pretty much everything. So we all have items that don't really have monetary value and which are pretty useless, but we keep because of what it means or the memories attached to it. So that's the sort of mindset. It's just applied to a much wider range of things. So the blue tack is something that she's kept on her bedside for well over a decade. When her niece Lena was little and just starting school, she couldn't pay attention in the classroom. She was quite anxious, and she would tap on things, and that annoyed the other kids and the teacher that her hands were sort of doing a tappy thing. And she figured out if she got a bit of Play-Doh in the first instance, she figured out with a bit of blue tack from Nick's house, from her auntie's house, that if she squeezed that, it was a silent little way of focusing her hands so she could concentrate. So she's really sort of self-comforting and self-help. And then she was accused of actually stealing that blue tack from the teacher's desk, which is pretty heartbreaking situation to go through.
It is really heartbreaking.
Yeah.
And it's like a defining moment in her.
Yeah. To feel that she's done something that she felt proud of, that she'd found a way to self-soothe, and her auntie had helped her. And then she's had this accusation. Anyway, the school sorts all that out. Nick goes up like the fiery auntie she is, along with Lena's mother, and sorts it all out. And then Lena is allowed to use a little bit of Play-Doh in the classroom for that same thing. And Nick keeps that blue tack, because everything I've just said, this whole long story, which, you know, would only an auntie or maybe a mum in the family would care about all that, right? But all that is in this little bit of blue tack that just, you know, of course is going to dry out and go crusty with time. But every time she looks at that or sees that, it's taking in this whole era of her life when she had this little girl who trusted her and confided in her. It's you know, bringing to mind the spirit of that kid and what that's grown into. It's bringing to mind one of the only times when Nick and her sister Michelle, Lena's mum, were united in a cause because they don't get on. All this stuff is tied up into this tiny little blurt of blue tack that anyone going out and cleaning that house would just chuck in the bin.
The blue tack, I feel, is the perfect example where to talk about the issue of class, and to go really deep into it, because something that struck me while reading this, which I've subsequently heard you talk about and I want to talk about tonight, is that Nick has all of these objects in her home, and because of how many things she has in her home, she is like diagnosed with this hoarding disorder. If a very, very rich person had a very, very big home and put every single one of these objects on its own plinth and had a catalog with didactics for each one of these objects, they could have the exact same number of objects. It could even be very cluttered. It could be very eccentric, and it would not be diagnosed in the same way. Talk to me about how was it, I suppose, frustrating, disheartening? Did you see any cause for hope about how classist our engagement with this issue is?
Oh, yeah, hope not so much. Look, it's exactly as you say, that the perception of outsiders, whatever that might be in a situation, on what the worth of someone's stuff is a really big part of whether someone is considered a pack rat or a hoarder or a collector or an eccentric billionaire with a home full of stuff that will become a museum. You know, I've often used the example of Andy Warhol, the iconic American artist, who was by any current definition a hoarder. And he, before he died, packaged up, I think I always forget the exact number, but it's over 200. It's 220 something boxes of stuff.
And now they're held in a museum.
They're held in a museum. Before COVID, there was an event series at the museum where visiting contemporary artists would open a box and talk about the contents. And when I say stuff, it's exactly that. It's stuff. Some of it's incredibly valuable, either for historical reason. I think one of the objects that was opened on one of those nights was like an invitation to dinner at the White House, but also half-eaten pizza. Like the whole full range of stuff. And he obviously thought it was all valuable. He kept it all. He packaged it up. That's now art. Now, any home I've been to with people who've been labelled with hoarding disorder could make those boxes. They could easily make those boxes, but no one's calling that art, because people are going in and they're already saying this person's an artist, therefore what they have is art. And the same happens in a lot of different levels. I mean, at the most basic practical level, if someone owns their own home or their own space, the leeway they have to do whatever the hell they want with it.
Sorry, in Australia, it always comes back to real estate.
Right, exactly.
Always.
Which is, I actually needed to, in this book, make Nick have to have inherited this home through various circumstances, because there's no way a retail worker in Sydney owns even a little shabby cottage in Leichhardt. Like, it's just not possible unless that's inherited. And if she didn't own it, then the problem, or to her happy home situation, could never have got to the stage it was. Because if you're renting or if you're housing commission,
by monthly inspections.
Absolutely. And that intervention happens much earlier. If you have money to have someone intervene on your behalf. You have a lawyer to make interventions. If you do have a cleanup order, all those things can come into it. One of the people I met through this who approached me when they found out I was working on this, told me about a family member who had literally bought a second property because that stopped the family conflict, because he could continue to live with his family, because that is a big thing, of course, family conflict. People saying, I can't live with you anymore like this. He bought a property down the road and he filled that with his stuff, and he could go and sit there and be amongst it while keeping the family home. Now whether over the years that will continue to fill up remains to be seen. But the thing is it's why the diagnosis of hoarding disorder is really controversial in a lot of ways. And Nick is labeled with that in the book, but I would not choose to, not just because I'm not a psychologist, but just in general, I guess, definitional terms, find it difficult, because at least part of the criteria for diagnosing someone is that their living spaces have become unlivable. And that happens a lot more quickly for some people than others. So there are other criteria which are important, which would happen whatever kind of space you're in, however much money you have, like the distress at getting rid of things. But that really important matter about a space becoming unlivable, the bigger the house you have, the more capability you have to pay for more space, all of those things would actually mean that someone who is poorer, or who for whatever reason has less space to call their own and to expand into, will fit that diagnostic criteria much, much faster than someone wealthy with heaps of space, or who can buy a house down the road so that their living space with their family isn't impacted.
I want to bring it back to the plot, the sort of plot and the characters in your book now. It's not so much a spoiler, it's sort of the early catalyzing incident is that Nick has an accident, falls down, hurts herself in her home. She had her and Lena go for, what is it, morning tea or lunch? Lunch every Sunday. And Nick misses lunch with her niece. And so Lena goes by the home to check on her and finds where she's been lying, unable to get up, unable to get help. And that's when Lena sees the home and the state it's in. I remember a conversation you and I had maybe 6 or more than 6 months ago, where you spoke about why it was so important that the relationship between the person who was exhibiting this hoarding type behavior and the person who discovered it was an auntie and niece relationship. Can you talk about that?
I can. I don't remember what I said in that conversation.
Well, it was incredibly insightful.
Okay.
Well, just that.
So say the insightful thing if I don't say that now.
Okay.
No. Well, for me, in my thinking in that, I mean, there are other reasons I wanted to write about that kind of relationship, but I also really think about this idea of who is responsible for who. It's like the flip side of this question that a lot of the researchers are asking at the Charles Perkins Centre, which is, how do you help someone who doesn't want help? Should you even help someone who doesn't want help or doesn't think they need help? Where are the lines? If someone's just like, no, I'm happy like this. The flip side of that is who we each feel responsibility for in our families, in our community, in our street, in our country, in our world. Whose business am I? Or who is my business? And I think certainly in the sort of Anglo culture I grew up in, parents and children, and it certainly doesn't always happen this way, but there's a societal expectation that you're responsible for each other. So parents, of course, for their kids growing up, and then as you are an adult, you are responsible for your parents. Outside of that, as you get into the wider circles of a family, you might be involved in their lives, but there's not the same thing. There's not the same obligation that, in this case, a 20-year-old uni student is going to drop everything to take care of her auntie and clean up her mess. It's just not something that anyone would expect of her. And that's why I found it a much more interesting kind of thing to write about. Well, okay, what is it then? What is it that makes someone, including a young person or anyone, say this is my, maybe not duty, this is something I care about, and this person is mine to take care of.
You also have very close relationships with your, is it nieces and nephews, or nieces in particular?
Yeah, so I like to use the little used term nibblings, which is the non-gender specific form. I'm trying to get that taken up a lot more. Me and my former
I'm
editor,
delighted
Emma
to take that up.
Rafferty,
Yep.
we are fighting a battle to get nibblings in as common use as siblings. Yes.
Oh, lovely. But I don't know. I have one uncle by blood who was always sort of living overseas, so I don't like have a particularly close relationship. And then I grew up with that delightful thing of my mother, who had sort of half a dozen really close female friends who I call my aunties. But I have read, in reading around for preparation for tonight, so many book reviews or just people, not necessarily official reviews, but just people sharing what they thought about your book, saying that this was like the first time that they'd read about an auntie niece or auntie nibbling relationship.
No one wrote that in the review.
No, not the nibbling thing, but no, but just why
Yeah.
do you think that is so underexplored?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, there are plenty of books that do have that relationship in them, I should say. I'm certainly not doing a first here.
Well, for a lot of people,
but
it obviously was.
It's not particularly common, and it is often one of two extremes, which is the evil, nasty aunt, the Jane Eyre aunt who locks her in the red room, or Aunt March in Little Women. It's that kind of character. Or there's Auntie Mame, who I certainly grew up wanting to be once I realized I wasn't going to have kids of my own, who's the, fabulous jet setting kind of person. And those are wonderful archetypes, and they do occur across fiction. But this is a much derided term, but this is a domestic novel in a sense, and it's about family. And in that setting, I think, and particularly in this sort of Anglo-Australian tradition, we don't have that real tradition of writing about extended families in that way, or family relationships that, for me, and this is my life experience coming into it, but certainly growing up, my aunties, particularly my mum's sisters, they were living adult lives that were completely different to my parents. So one was an artist, one was a musician, they didn't have children, and they just were models for different ways of being an adult woman or an adult that I didn't have. And that was really important to me. And without meaning to do it, I've realized that I have become that for these other children. I did not plan them, because you can't plan someone else's children. But I have them, and we are really close. And I've seen the ways in which that can be really important, that even in circumstances where kids are absolutely loved and adored in their families, sometimes there's just things they can't talk about, or they can't connect with, or they don't connect with the parent. And to have an adult who is family but who isn't their mum or their dad can be incredibly important, and the bonds that can be formed, and it might be friends who you just call auntie, like friends of your mum. It's not necessarily a blood relationship, but those kind of adult children relationships can be so incredibly important. But even saying that feels a bit wrong, talking about having close bonds with someone else's kids. Like, our society is so judgmental on, why is this childless person so close to my child?
Like a trespass, is it, or something?
Yeah. Without even putting things of abuse or anything like that on it, there's a sense of like, is it odd that this person's interested in my kid? Like, I'm interested in them because they're my kid. But
I've never
why are
even
you
thought
interested in
about
my
that
kid?
before.
Yeah. And it's something that even, Lena thinks in the
My
novel,
little
like,
internalized misogyny flag is going off.
please.
Like, why are we just like inherently suspicious of women who don't have children, full stop?
Yes.
And yes. Okay, great. Done.
And it is, you're right, because it's a no-win thing, because if you're a woman without kids who isn't interested in other people's kids, then that's worse, because you're very cold and you hate children, and what's wrong with you? So at least as someone who is very I am really good with kids, I love being around them, I love playing with them, I do get a certain level of woman points for that, even though they're not my own. It's just if you become too close to them, this kind of thing, like, you're not their mother, don't get involved.
I want to talk about Lena. because, like, even the blurb of this book, and it is, a book about Nick, and that's the sort of driving story, but there is some huge shit happening with Lena. And I was very, very invested in her, what I would describe as her sort of simultaneous her journey through the book. And she is a very present character in the book. Her, without, again, no real big spoilers, it happens relatively early on. She is the victim survivor of one of those awful incidents that do occur, of like the, would you describe it, like the university frat boy dorm sex tape is recorded without knowledge of young woman
Exactly
situation.
how I described
yeah
it.
great
That's what it is.
And so that's what she's dealing with, is like the immediate aftermath of that happening in her life. And it was certainly one of the first times I'd read, obviously I read a lot around that type of content, and it was the first time I'd read it rendered so realistic in terms of like the pragmatic effects on someone's life. Do they get kicked out of uni because they can't go to the class because he's still in the class? All of the kind of quotidian shit that you as a survivor still just have to keep dealing with. What I want to ask you about, though, is what you were trying to do, or if you were trying to do something at Slash, please talk about in general, the effect of Lena being made into a sort of sex object, and the title of this book being Love Objects, and how, like, what is this? I'm struggling to find the words for it, but it was recurring to me throughout the book, this conflation of love object, human being. Is that something around that what you were going for?
Yeah, I mean, the title came much later, so it wasn't in those words, but certainly the ideas around that and objectification, and ideas around how much we get to choose how other people see us as well. Like something that I think is to do with power, and class comes into this, and gender and all kinds of things. But however you see yourself, however empowered you feel you are and happy in your life, if someone with more power or in a particular, in temporary position of power chooses to see you in a different way, that's what you become in terms of that effect. So with Lena, and this sort of definitely ties in with what's happening with Nick, but with Lena, she has a sexual encounter she feels very great about. She is not taken advantage of. There's full consent. She has, there's some iffy stuff in there because he's just a bit of an idiot, but she's definitely into it. She's definitely into it. She has a great time. There's no problem with the sexual encounter itself, but her feeling of coming away from that feeling empowered and great and physically good and emotionally and mentally good, that is all then just snatched away from her because he's filmed this and turned it into something to share with other blokes, which she did not consent to. And she is not made to feel, she does feel shame for something that she didn't do. What she did do, she loved. What she didn't do has made her feel shame and has turned her into, she thinks of herself now as this object on the screen that other people are responding to. And she
literally rating.
And literally rating. And so she thinks of herself in that way too, and begins to think of other women in that way. What rating are these other women getting on there? So she's sort of in this thing of thinking of herself as the object she's been turned into, which is incredibly as distressing as it sounds, and distressing to think about and write. That tied in with a lot of stuff I was thinking about as well, though, with Nick and the label that's put on her, including by Lena, who thinks she's doing a good thing by helping cleaning up after her aunt, but is actually really imposing something on her that she doesn't identify with and doesn't want, and makes her feel really, really violated. And I think the one example is a lot clearer to see for many of us, and the other not so much. But there's really related things there of who gets to say that this is who you are, and this is what your problem is that needs to be fixed.
Thank you for that. You have many other books, as I read out in your bio. The one sort of most famously an isolated incident, also deals with the sort of aftermath of a woman being assaulted and killed. And your other fiction, Taming the Beast, which was your first novel, involved sort of sex, gender, power dynamics being crossed and done wrong. And your nonfiction is all about sex and power. How, I want to know, is like you're sort of definitely at this stride of your career. Do you think about your, I don't know how to say the word, oeuvre? I only ever read it, I never say it. Do you think about the themes that you tend to return to again and again? Is that something that you think about?
No. And I know that that sounds ridiculous and unbelievable, but I really don't. Like, obviously I can see it looking back and when other people point it out. With the nonfiction, that's not as true, because I know with the nonfiction work that is actually a lot more grows out of specific rage that I want to channel. I know you'd be familiar
Relatable.
with this, channel into something that might actually be useful and helpful in using the skills that I have, which happen to be writing. You have additional skills in the law. I don't have those. That's my thing that I feel I can do that's useful. So that is a lot more thought out in that way. With fiction, it really does start for me with character, and with an immersion into character. And just as this book really started to obsess me when I started to see this figure of Nick. And then once Lena came up, it was the same thing of really immersing myself into thinking what life is like for this particular 20-year-old at this point in time who comes from this kind of background in this kind of situation. So I think the fact that these themes keep coming up, obviously they're things that interest me and that I notice and that I think about, because they're the things that I think about in terms of my characters' lives. But they're also, in contemporary fiction, I'm looking at this world as it is right now, and tell me a 20-year-old woman at university who isn't in some way dealing with this shit. Like, it's might be my kind of obsession that I come back to, but it's also, this is the world that these characters are living in. And the same with Isolated Incident, obviously that, you know, has a specific story that I chose to tell, but the context of that story, the world that those characters are living in, is this one. And this is the stuff that's going on in it.
I just want to remind everyone watching at home that I have 2 or 3 more questions for Emily. And if you have any questions, you can type them into the Q&A chat function at any time. I want to go back to the plot and about, I have the words here, the moment when Nick is institutionalized / patronized / controlled. You answered briefly that this was a process that you learned through like the research that you did during that year as the fellow at the Charles Perkins Center. But talk us through what actually happens in terms of the moment when like the system identifies a problem.
So the answer to that is it depends. There is no, as far as all my research showed, there is no straightforward system that clicks into place for someone in Nick's circumstances. It's much more ad hoc than that. If you talk to any of, you know, really hardworking social workers at hospitals, they do not have easy steps to take or any steps to take. They are case by case basis, you know, and it is better that way in some ways. Of what is this particular person's situation? How can we best help them? But there aren't resources. There aren't systems in place. There's charities that can help. You know, Catholic Care is one of the biggest ones that actually deals with these kind of situations. It's very ad hoc. The sort of thing that I have Nick go through in the book is probably what happens a lot of the time. There are very well-meaning and in some cases really actually excellent at their job and caring people in the hospital system, including social workers and other kinds of healthcare workers, who want to help this woman who has come in with bad injuries, and they can't let her go back to her home where that happened and where things are still as they were left. That is not their duty of care. Would be out the window if they were to do that. They need to rely a lot on the family. In this case, that's Lena, who's all there is. Some people do not have family to help out in this situation. So in those cases, things might be taken out of the person's hands, out of someone like Nick's hands, in terms of calling in council cleanups or other kind of contracts or charities. So that's why a lot of these sort of periphery characters in this book see Nick as really lucky that she has Lena, has a family member who's willing to make that home safe for her to return to. And in the context of what can happen, she absolutely is. But the thing to remember in all this is, from Nick's point of view, from the patient's point of view, there is no problem to be solved. There is nothing that's wrong. She had a fall, people have falls, whatever. She's being turned into, the phrase is used, like a public health and safety hazard, which just bears no relationship to how she sees herself and is so insulting and violating to her. So it is, one of the things that I love that fiction can do, and the more and more as I go on in my writing career, is something that I'm always interested in as a reader as well, is this idea that the really hard conflicts in life are often between all good people trying to do the right thing. It's not baddies and goodies or enemies. It's the disagreement on what the right thing is, or the gaps in what is possible because of how systems are set up or how understanding is. And so, I think that's something that I hope the complexity comes through in the novel, that actually everyone's trying to do the right thing. It's just such a huge mismatch in how Nick sees herself and what she feels is the right thing, and other people feeling that they know better.
The very sort of seemingly organic response for someone who's unfamiliar with hoarding behaviors is like, okay, crack team assemble, working bee, get in there and clean it out before they come home, and then problem solved, fresh start. Is that like sort of the myth 101?
It is. And this is where, even though I've said I can be a bit about labels, this is where the difference between what is currently called hoarding disorder and other kinds of hoarding behavior is really important. So until quick medical history, until 2013, hoarding behavior was generally considered to be a symptom of other conditions, either dementia, particularly in geriatrics, or obsessive compulsive disorder. In 2013, it got its own heading, its own thing in the DSM, which is the Psychiatric Diagnostic Manual, and a different set of behaviours driving what looks the same to you or I. Look at a home, say this is a hoarder. If that hoarding behaviour is coming from something like OCD, then that is a behavior that probably the person is feeling really distressed by. They actually don't want to have to keep all that stuff, but they feel they need to, in the way that people with OCD have other compulsions that they feel they need to do. So that needs to be treated in one way. If the clutter is caused because someone has dementia or physical disabilities where they just can't clean out their space, then a working bee, get a crack team and clean it out is a gift. It's wonderful. It's exactly what's needed. If it's some kind of inability for someone to clear their space, then that's the best, absolutely wonderful. What is currently called hoarding disorder and that set of behaviours, clearing that space out without consent or with consent, but the person's not really willing, so coercion, I guess, is absolutely disastrous. I have known of cases where there have been suicides from that. It is, I think any of us can understand how distressing it would be if you were to go home tonight and people who say they love you and care about you have gone and taken stuff out of your house according to what they think you should have and not, and gone through all your things and thrown out a bunch of stuff without asking you about it. It's really violating. And for people with what's called hoarding disorder, that's intensified because of the real attachment to things, that sense of violation anyone would feel. So the distress it can cause really can't be overstated. And so it's so incredibly different to a situation where someone has let things or not been able to help things getting on top of them. And so there's just a lot of clutter and mess. The treatment for trying to make a home safe, which should be the goal, not make someone into a minimalist, but to make it safe from harm, needs to be completely different with someone with this set of behaviours.
My final question for you before we go to audience questions. Did your relationship to objects change throughout the process of reading and writing this book? Because even the experience, researching for and writing this book, because even the experience for me of reading it made me think more deeply about why I do and don't attach emotion or value to some things and not others.
Yeah, it definitely did. I mean, I didn't say before, I sort of have been interested in hoarding behavior for a long time, but I've also been interested in general in people's relationships to their stuff. Like, that is just something I find endlessly fascinating. And I definitely paid a lot more attention. I mean, one thing that I found from sitting with people in their homes is that I would walk in and I would see a lot of just stuff. I couldn't even really see what any individual item was, because it would often just be heaps of things. But as soon as I would ask about one item, whatever it was, there was always a story behind it. There's that care for objects again. And it might be an imagined story, or it might be just about the day that they'd actually got it. But also it was often real attention to the specifics of that item. So a bit of really beautiful stitching, or how something was made, or if it was broken, it would be about how it could be fixed and still be useful. So this thought, I moved house while working on one of the later drafts of this book. And one part of me, I chucked out a lot of stuff, which I think a lot of people do when they move, because you realize as you're packing it, what am I going to do when I unpack this? Just not use it still for another 8 years. So I definitely did that.
Do I need 4 soup ladles?
But I think I became more willing to be attached to certain items that didn't have a use, because I was thinking of them more in that way. And it's not my tendency towards hoarding behavior. I've always lived in quite small spaces too. But I do kind of have that thing now where I look at something and as Nick would, and as I got into my mind to think, is like, what work has gone into making this? Like, what are we just discarding all this stuff? Surely it can be used or cared for. And I don't anthropomorphize things in the way that Nick does sometimes, but to really think about the life of objects, what's gone into getting them to this place now, and to actually have a bit more respect for that. I actually think that's a pretty good thing.
Something that struck me too when I was reading was that Nick has the most incredible memory and memory capacity, and that it is a sort of widely acknowledged memory assisting tool to almost externalize memories, either things that have happened or just things that you want to try and remember, to attach those memories to an item, either like real or imagined, because then it triggers the memory and you can access wider memories than you could if you just sort of sat there on your own in a vacuum trying to remember them all.
Yeah, so a lot of people with hoarding behavior, that's a real fear of theirs. If you talk about what do you fear will happen when we get rid of this, that's one of those things that they won't even talk about it like the trigger to the memory will be gone. It's like the memory itself will be gone. Like, that thing never happened. If I don't have this thing holding it,
then it is gone.
Yeah,
right?
That's right. And so, and again, I think everybody can relate to this with at least a couple of items. You know, there's a reason people hang on to the footy jersey from when they were 14 and they won the grand final. Or whatever it is, kids' drawings from when they were little. Like, everyone's got that object, but there can be a sense with some people that, yeah, did I live? Did I even do these things? Did my life happen if I don't have these anchors? And of course they did. And you know, there's been some research into how accurate people's perception of their own reaction to getting rid of the stuff will be in this situation. So you know, there's been studies where they'll ask someone, if I get rid of this notebook that is one of 87 that you have just in this one little space, what level of distress do you think you will feel? And the person will say 10. And then the psychologist or social worker will say, well, okay, I'm going to take it for 24 hours and I'll bring it back to you. And then they check in over that 24 hours. What level of distress are you feeling? And it's much lower. It's not 10. It's, you know, might be 8 to start with. And then by the time they bring it back, it might be down to a 3 or 4, depending on what the item is, because there is still a difference. But so part of this can be about building up someone's sense of belief in their own resilience and in their own ability to remember things or to feel safe and comfortable without the object actually there.
Just so sucks thinking of how much fear these people have. Like, it sucks like for them.
Comes from people saying you have to get rid of it. So that's a really key thing in here too. The experience of living amongst the stuff tends to be perfectly happy and not fearful. So that does come back to the question of
Who gets to make the call?
who gets to make the call, and are there ways to minimize harm without telling someone you can't have your happiness with these items. This isn't the right way to have happiness, is being surrounded by items.
You can buy shit. You can buy so much shit, but you can't buy it and keep it like that.
No,
Yeah.
you can, what you've spent on secondhand stuff or picking up off the street, if you were to spend that much amount of money on a particular designer jacket and have it hanging
That's
in the
fine.
almost empty closet in your minimalist home, and that gives you a sense of accomplishment and everything, that's all right. But you can't feel good about yourself having all this stuff.
All right, time. Yes, exactly 10 minutes. Good girl. Yes, we have plenty of audience questions already. I'll go here and then there and then there, please.
First of all, I'm almost finished the book. I've also found it a bit confronting. Nibblings. Please say the word nibblings. I love this. I'm going to take that to my sister, because my sister calls me parent C. Love it. But my mother is a hoarder. But not, I guess now we call her a hoarder. But so listening. But also then, like, I didn't quite grab if it was just that. That's no protection from anything, is it? But refuses to accept. Sorry, yes, I'm asking the question. Sorry, but sorry, it's a process. My father is quite a ruthless. I mean, obviously I can't give actual advice, and I'm not a psychologist or a therapist on this, but it's just from experience. I mean, first of all, that the research is actually very new, given that this has only been considered its own thing since 2013. There aren't really solid answers, but there's a really high prevalence of comorbidity with social anxiety, with generalized depression. So how those threads come together, actually no one's really sort of definitively said that yet, but there's definitely crossover with anxiety and with depression. So that's not unusual at all. In terms of how other people react, I mean, it's so complicated, because one of the stereotypes about people who hoard is that they're all older people. But often what's actually happened is that that's the time in the life when someone's living alone for the first time. And things often get to that dangerous, or to physically dangerous level, when there isn't someone else to curb it a bit. So whether that's causing someone unhappiness or not, I couldn't make a judgment on that, but it's certainly a thing that often people have these tendencies, but it's stopped from getting into something that will be actually physically dangerous or risky because of the other people living in the home, and that give and take that happens in most relationships or families, that someone maybe doesn't have things exactly as they want, but that once that contact is gone, or that conflict is gone, that can be when it gets out of control, so that the space becomes unlivable. So yeah, it's complicated is the answer. Yeah.
Thank you. I also just remembered with the next questions, I'm supposed to repeat them into the microphone so that people watching at home can hear them. But you had a question, please. Go for it. Just to repeat the question for people watching at home, one very, I would say, perceptive reader thought that they were seeing disordered eating behaviors in Lena, who's Nick's niece, and whether or not that relates to sort of control and the need to control and controlling type behaviors, and that that's also the person who cleans out Nick's home.
That is a very perceptive question. I didn't write Lena as anorexic, although certainly she does have disordered eating in a way that I think is actually sadly really, really common for not just women in her age group, but you know, all over the spectrum. Definitely the control thing is part of that. Something that we haven't talked that much about, but that is the fact that Lena is sort of the first one in her family to go to university. She's sort of trying to lift out of the class that she sees herself as grown up in, which is part of why she falls for this
dickhead.
I mean, yeah. You know, part of that though is this idea that there's a certain level of control, and certainly thinness is part of that is a marker of fitting into certain class strata. In her case, it happens to, you know, coincide with the fact that she doesn't have much money, and it is actually expensive to eat healthy food in Sydney. So she thinks of it as, I'm on the rich girl diet, but on a poor budget, that means she gets extra thin.
But that was a huge thing at Charles Perkins Center as well, is like that's their sort of raison d'etre, is like the overlap obesity and the overlap between class and obesity. And so for Lena at university, that the thinness is at least one box that she feels she can tick in terms of fitting in with this new cohort of what she perceives to be like a higher level of class.
Absolutely. And part of her, and this goes back to the question, part of her revulsion at what she's found at Nick's place, you know, she loves her aunt, she's worried about it, but she does feel a revulsion to it. Part of that is this feeling that she's got no control. Like, this is greed. This is, you know, there's something so embarrassing to her or shameful about wanting stuff and having it, because she's sort of learned to fit in and to rise up in the world. It's better to not want things, or at least not to ever show you want something. And that of course ties into the fact that she had some really good sex, and now look what's happened. She wanted something, she had it, and now look at this.
I feel like there was one more hand. Yes, please. Excellent question. which was so well put. That this recurring theme of shame, that Lena is shamed for what she wants and goes for in terms of sex, that Nick is shamed for what she loves and enjoys living, her lifestyle that she enjoys and loves. The question was, are men just impervious to shame?
To which my glib but not untrue answer is, too many of them are. But no, I do think it operates differently, and certainly there are class aspects, racialized aspects to who is made to feel shame and for what. But I do think women in particular are still often made to feel shame for pleasure and for enjoyment. And if that doesn't fit the parameters of what a wider society thinks it should be, whether that's to do with food or sex or whatever it is, I do think actually, being more serious, for some men, shame is probably at the root of a lot of problems. But that's going into the whole question of masculinity, and why a lot of men have so much trouble actually speaking about the things that might be eating away at them and acting out in different ways. It's a kind of a much bigger question. I think in the context of this book and a lot of the national conversation we're having now around things that have gone on in Parliament and those kind of places, I think really the crux of this is that the men who absolutely should feel shame because what they've done is actually real damage and exploitation of other human beings are not the ones feeling it.
You do like the third character that appears more towards the end of the book, Will, who is Nick's other nibbling, Lena's brother. I mean, he feels shame. He had a short period, well, comparatively short period in incarceration for, well, what it does matter. And I felt there was some shame there in terms of something that we also spoke about this evening, where he was loving towards children that were not his own. And then when that relationship with the mother sort of failed, and so he was just like booted out of the kids' lives, I think there was a shame there where it was like, well, where do I put this love? I felt love towards what was basically stepchildren, but sort of as a man, he's like shamed for how silly that is or something.
Yeah, and slightly suspect. I mean, really quite suspect about it. So just to be clear, for those who haven't read it, the thing he went to jail for is nothing to do with caring about children. That's a completely separate thing. But yes, he definitely has shame around that. I mean, he is someone who is quite conscious and wants to be a good person or a good man, and can't quite get a handle on how to do that. And for him,
it's really hard when you're broke. When you are like dead broke every day, it's really hard to perform those roles. That's what I got from him.
Yeah, and the work that he wanted to do and started to train for, he can't do because of his time in prison. He feels like he's got a lot of love, but that's not something that he feels as a cis straight male, which is also a description he wouldn't use for himself. But it's not really a thing you go around saying, I have all this love for my family, for these kids that I lived with for a long time with my ex. And actually no one wants to hear about that or talk about that. So what do you do with it? Where does it go? There's not really a healthy seeming way to express that for men like him.
Was there one more hand? Was there a raised hand here? No. Oh. The question was, what was the level of intent, or what was the thinking behind having the main male character be so full of love compared to?
Yeah, so Will's the only sort of point of view character, the character to go on to. And actually initially, again, so my the way that I think my way into novels wasn't thinking about any of this big theme stuff at all. It was really thinking about a family that's been scattered and shattered, but not because any of those members of that family have hurt or wounded each other or done anything terrible. It's just like life has happened in a particular way and they've been wrenched apart. And so Will was part of that configuration where he sort of comes in quite late to it. He's been really cast out, even though he's still got all that love for his family. Certainly, though, inevitably, as I got into later drafts too, thinking about the contrast between him and Josh, who's the dickhead who we've spoken about before. And he's kind of, Josh is someone, I don't get into his point of view, but he's someone who assumes that he's right and a good guy. And if he does something that he sees has hurt someone, it's an aberration. He's still a good guy. Whereas Will is someone, because of his different circumstances growing up, and a lot of that is to do with poverty and his time in prison, assumes that people will think he's a bad guy and he needs to prove otherwise. So he's coming from that more defensive position. And that was really interesting to me about him. And the other sort of male character who was strongly in my head, although he's mostly absent in the book because he is literally absent in their lives, is Will and Lena's father, who died when they were quite young. But they remember him as a really good man. And by all accounts, he was not a perfect man, because no one is. But he is this kind of figure that Will wonders about all the time, because if he was still around, maybe he would be able to tell him how to deal with this stuff and how to be a man, but he's not there. And the idea of him is a kind of pressure, a nice one, because he was a good man, but it's still a kind of pressure that Will doesn't quite know how to accommodate that into his actual problems that he has to deal with.
That's all we have time for. We're 5 minutes over time, which is perfect. The next pick for book club for B-List is The Shape of Sound by Fiona Murphy, which Emily and I have both read.
So good.
So good. So good. It is Fiona Murphy's first book. I'm just going to read the blurb because it's quite short. Fiona Murphy kept her secret for over 25 years, but then, desperate to pursue her career, she tried hearing aids. Shocked by the sound of the world, she vowed never to wear them again. Eventually, she discovered that sign language could change her life and that deaf culture could be part of her identity. The Shape of Sound is a compelling exploration of sound, silence, and the self, a memoir about the corrosive power of secrets and how deaf experiences and disability are shaped by economics, politics, medicine, and social expectations. This is the story of how Fiona learned to listen to her body. It is an exquisitely written book that truly changed the way I thought about hearing and just sound as an experience and about my body. And it's incredible. The State Library of New South Wales bookstore is open for you to buy Fiona Murphy's book for next month, and also, of course, for you to buy Emily Maguire's book, Love Objects. And for those watching at home, the State Library of New South Wales bookstore also delivers. End plug. Would you all please give a huge and warm round of applause for Emily Maguire?
And to Brie for wonderful.
Thank you, and see you next month.